Hello again, everyone. I wanted to do a follow-up video to a crash course on biblical astronomy. So I had someone ask me about one of the things I mentioned in the previous video that I would explain, and I forgot to do it. So I mentioned Sagittarius. I didn't explain that. So I wanted to talk about that and then fill in some of the blanks. So it's hard to contain all this information in one video, and the last one was borderline a documentary. So I'll try to be as concise as I can and hopefully um, connect some more dots for you. So just to give a quick synopsis, in the previous video I talked about how signs in the heavens are very biblical and actually one of the three fundamental ways in which God communicates to mankind. So the first way is through his word, which is inerrant, and we have a recorded version of it, and that's called the Bible. And the second way is through the Holy Spirit, who permanently indwells the church. And then the third way, of course, is the signs in the heavens. So on the fourth day of creation, he created the sun, moon, and stars to serve as lights, to separate between the day and the night. And secondly, they were created to serve as signs, and that is distinct from seasons, and also as well distinct from marking days and years. It's a particular purpose God made to serve as signs, and this purpose is neglected and just generally actually scoffed at and mocked at, even in the Christian community. And I wish that wasn't the case. So according to Psalm 19, God doesn't just communicate to us through the stars from time to time, sporadically, or on once in a blue moon, but he actually communicates to us through the encoded information in the heavens every single day and every single night, if we would be willing to listen and see it. And secondly, I talked about the constellations and just kind of tried to give a primer on it. And I wanted to go over that one more time, but I'm going to do it really quickly. So the ecliptic is the plane along which the Earth travels around the sun, so it's our orbit around the sun. And because we're moving in relation to the sun appears to be moving along the ecliptic. And with the sun are all the other planets as well. So they're moving along the ecliptic, and the moon. Sun, moon, and planets are moving along, constantly traversing it. And the 12 signs is actually a biblical concept. The 12 signs are the constellations that fall along the ecliptic. These are completely biblical, and the book of Job mentions the 12 signs, and the book of 2 Kings mentions the 12 signs, and particular constellations are mentioned by name. So in the book of Acts, the figures contained in the constellation Gemini are mentioned as the twin gods, so Pollux and Castor. And the Pleiades, which is at the back end of Taurus the bull, is mentioned in multiple places in the Bible. So it's a grouping that looks like 7 stars in a cluster. And Orion is mentioned several times in the Bible. And some of the other constellations seem to be mentioned as well, but it's not quite as clear. Leo is clearly mentioned, Virgo is clearly mentioned. And some of these other constellations represent things that are mentioned in the Bible. So I'll talk about that real quick. So in the biblical Mazzaroth is the 12 signs. Virgo is the first constellation, and Leo is the last constellation. In the biblical sense of things, since they begin with Virgo, everything travels this direction along the ecliptic, the sun, moon, and planets. And beginning with Virgo, and they come all the way around the orbit, all the way around the plane, and eventually they end up in Leo, and then they start the cycle all over again. And the 12 signs tell the story of redemption, and important events in history have taken place when there's been significant or important conjunctions with the 12 signs. So we talked about the Star of Bethlehem, which is pretty widely agreed to be a certain series of conjunctions between Jupiter and the star Regulus, as well as Jupiter and Venus in the years 3 and 2 BC. And the woman Virgo is, this constellation is universally recognized to be a woman, to be the maiden or virgin. And when I say universally, what I'm saying is all of the cultures in the ancient Middle East during the time of Christ and even beforehand. So just think Assyrians, Babylonians, Egyptians, Greeks, Romans, and of course the Hebrews. So universal Middle Eastern knowledge while the Bible was being composed that Virgo was the woman or the virgin, and she has a womb. And the signs that we've been following in recent years that seem to be pointing to the rapture of the church, the tribulation, and the second coming of Christ seem to begin around the end of 2016. So that's when Jupiter entered the womb of Virgo the Virgin, whereas at the same time, a comet had come out of the loins of Leo the Lion, which represents the tribe of Judah, represents Christ. Revelation 5:5 says Jesus is the Lion of the tribe of Judah. It represents God and his royalty and his sovereignty and his authority to reign. And so a comet came out of the loins of Leo the Lion right here, traveled down, came into the womb of Virgo, came down to the bottom of her womb at the exact same time that Jupiter entered the womb. And then Jupiter remained in Virgo's womb for 9.5 or 10 months, so the length of a human pregnancy, before coming out as the Revelation 12 sign formed on September 23rd and 24th of 2017, fulfilling the first two verses of Revelation chapter 12 perfectly and precisely. So that's the first sign. Now, I also talked about how over the course of 12 years, Jupiter will go all the way around the ecliptic, but it will get to each of the constellations in the Mazzaroth between 2016 and 2027. So it will actually enter into the final or Omega constellation of Leo in July of 2027, just shortly before the fall. And I think that that is depicting the conclusion, possibly, and this is just speculation, of the tribulation, because Jupiter will have gone through all the constellations, and the constellations tell the story of redemption. Now, what's interesting about that is that I'm going to fast forward a few years here. At the moment, there appears to be a standoff between Jupiter, which we had previously identified as the pre-glorified Christ at his first coming, because Jupiter is the second brightest planet, and it also has stripes covering its surface, like the stripes on Christ when he was flogged, and it also has a great red spot on the other side that resembles Christ's spear wound. But it is the second brightest of the planets, and it is the king planet, and it was recognized as such at the time of Christ, and so it represented his first coming. The brightest planet is Venus, and that represents Christ at his second coming. And Jesus compares himself directly with the planet Venus in Revelation 22:16, calling himself the bright morning star. But we also recognize that Jupiter represents the church, the pre-glorified church, because we are the body of Christ. And in Galatians 3, it says that we are the singular seed of Abraham with Christ. So we are the male child of Revelation 12 with Christ. We are included in that promise. And there are many elements of Revelation chapter 12 that are incompatible with it being a reflection of events that already transpired at Christ's first coming. In other words, Jesus And his life is a template of Revelation 12. He being a male child at one point, born of Mary, born in Israel, he ascended. But he was a template of the prophecy. The prophecy itself is pointing forward to the birth and rapture of the church and the onset of the tribulation events, Satan being cast down and all that. So presently, it looks like there is a standoff between the church and Saturn. And Saturn is one of the 5 visible planets, and it happens to be in the various Middle East or including Mediterranean cultures, Greeks and Romans, it had mythology as being sort of a god of destruction. So Saturn is associated with Kronos, and Kronos devoured children in their mythology. In Revelation 12, the dragon waits to devour the male child, which is the church. So I think it's important not to get too hung up on any one thing only representing one character, because the heavens are so multifaceted. There's so much information here, and God is revealing so much knowledge. And of course, all of the heavens reflect God's glory, and all of the heavens are about the story of redemption in which Christ is the center. And so Christ is the morning star, but Christ in a lot of ways is also Leo the lion, and there are many other aspects like Taurus that represents Christ. And so I believe Saturn represents Satan, and even the name itself sounds similar to Satan. But in another way, or in terms of constellations, I believe Satan, the great red dragon, is the accumulation of all of these constellations around Virgo and Leo. And so, oops. To show that one more time, there's 88 constellations in the sky. There's a ton of constellations. And there's one over here that kind of looks like a snake, but it's not a snake. It's a different constellation. But for some reason, all of the serpentine and Hydra and Dragon constellations, all of the serpents happen to be right in this area surrounding Virgo and Leo. And as I mentioned, I don't think people have really put this together, but it really looks like one giant dragon or serpent. And in Revelation 12, Satan is called both the serpent, referring to the serpent in Eden, but also the dragon. So he is the dragon and the serpent. And a dragon, of course, is just a type of serpent. The head of the constellation Serpens is here, and Serpens happens to have exactly 7 principal stars. And in Revelation 12, the great red dragon that is hurled down, which is Satan, has exactly 7 heads. So again, Serpens right here at the feet of the woman, and Venus is right in this location. I can show that one more time. So on the date in which I think the sign of the great red dragon was fulfilled, because of all the various meteor showers that were going off, Venus, the bright morning star, which represents Christ, also because of the Jupiter-Venus conjunction in November of 2017, after the Revelation 12 sign, can represent Christ in union with his church. So Christ the head and the church the body, unified together and glorified, as if newly born from the woman below her feet. And the 7 heads of the dragon right here, 7 principal stars of serpents right at her feet, right within striking range of Venus. And if you consider this point right here, the tail of Hydra, to represent the end of the great red dragon, you can put all of these dragons and serpents together and make one picture. So it begins here and it goes all the way around. And the only kind of puzzle piece that causes confusion is Cancer and Lynx, so these two constellations. But Lynx is a newer one with a bit of a confusing backstory. So I think there's some purposeful or maybe accidental obfuscation there. I'm not really sure, but I think if we could see it and understand it as God designed it, Lynx would be part of the Great Red Dragon. But the tail is here. It comes all the way around. It goes through Cancer, which is kind of like a threshold. It goes through Lynx, and then it comes down to Draco, the Great Dragon right here, Twisting Serpent, mentioned, I believe, in Job. So right here. And the tail and body of the Great Red Dragon start to diverge into the necks. So Hercules is in combat with a multi-headed serpent or dragon right here. So these kind of would be the necks diverging in 7 different directions. And they come down into Ophiuchus, which is the man representing Christ in combat with the serpent. And this represents the prophecy given in Genesis 3:15, where the seed of the woman would crush the head of the serpent, but in the process he would be wounded, and of course he was crucified as our atoning sacrifice and rose again. And Scorpius, which I believe may in some part be a part of the Great Red Dragon, his claw is right at the heel of Ophiuchus, where in the prophecy Christ is injured. So it's a perfect depiction of Genesis 3:15. When you put it all together, the tail begins here, it wraps all the way around Virgo and Leo. The necks diverge here, and then the 7 heads are serpents with the 7 principal stars exactly. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And as I mentioned, on October 8th, the Draconids were produced an extremely high number of shooting stars, very unusual because this meteor shower, which occurs sporadically, usually only produces 3 or 4 an hour. But on October 8th, 2018, about a year after the Revelation 12 sign, it was producing about 200 per hour as there were the Sextantids, the Orionids, and the Orgids. So 4 different meteor showers highlighted by the Draconids. So his tail was sweeping a third of the stars from heaven and casting them to the earth. Now, one thing I did not mention, which adds further weight to this understanding of the Great Red Dragon, is that right above the heads of serpents, the 7 stars of serpents, is Corona Borealis, the crown. And Corona Borealis has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 principal stars. And in Revelation 12, the Great Red Dragon has 7 crowns. So I think that adds further weight to this understanding and depiction. All right, and then we had Libra. The scales are altar. And I also didn't mention that Jupiter seems to be being weighed in the balance. So this could potentially represent judgment, and of course Christ steps in because we've been atoned for, and the accuser of our brethren is cast down, that is Satan, so he cannot strike the male child. And then the prophecy of Genesis 3:15 would be largely fulfilled next, when the head of the serpent is crushed, preventing him from striking the male child when we're raptured to safety. So I think that the church is the culmination and fulfillment of Genesis 3:15, whereas Christ was the center of it when he came the first time. His body is still on earth, and the dragon wants to catch us and devour us, but Christ steps in the way, crushes the heads of the serpent, and we escape. And that would be Genesis 3:15. And then we have Sagittarius, and this is the one I didn't talk about. But the first seal of Revelation 6, and I subscribe to the classic and kind of orthodox Protestant view of this, which is that these seals are opened after the rapture of the church. or in the case of historic Protestantism that doesn't necessarily hold to the pre-trib rapture, the seals open at the commencement of Daniel's 70th week. But the first seal is a rider on a white horse, and he represents the Antichrist. And notice how constellation Sagittarius, which is the the fourth constellation, so it's early on in the story of redemption, happens to be a person on a horse with a bow. And as you know, the first seal in Revelation 6 is a rider given a bow, and he goes out to conquer. And it also says that he's given a crown. And notice there's another crown here, Corona Australis. So the Antichrist is portrayed as a rider on a white horse with a bow in Revelation 6. He's the first seal, and he goes out to conquer, to gain dominion over the earth. I suppose simultaneous with Satan's being cast out of heaven. And in Revelation 13, we get a different depiction of the Antichrist as a beast rising up out of the sea. And after Satan is cast down to the earth, which is described in Revelation 12, in Revelation 13, Satan passes the baton, so to speak, because whereas he is currently the prince of the power of the air and the god of this age, he gets cast down and he loses his power and access in heaven. And so his control over the kingdoms of the earth is dependent on him gathering military and political power under one man, and that is the Antichrist. So Satan is desperate to regather his strength on earth, and so he passes the baton to the Antichrist. Revelation 13 tells us that Satan gives him his power and authority. Now, this is really key. As I mentioned, in Revelation 12, the seven-headed dragon has 7 crowns. And there are 7 principal stars in Corona Borealis. In Revelation 13, the beast from the sea has 10 crowns. And Corona Australis happens to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, exactly 10 principal stars. So I believe Sagittarius is more than just speculatively, but to me very clearly a representation of the first seal, because there's so many identifying markers. The 10 principal stars of Corona Australis corresponding to the 10 crowns given to the beast from the sea, a rider on a horse, given a bow to conquer, early on in the story, because it's the first seal. So Virgo is the first, Libra is the second, Scorpius is the third, Sagittarius is the fourth. Now, supposing the tribulation begins this year, and I think that that's very likely, the tribulation would terminate in 2027. As I mentioned, Jupiter will enter the Omega and final constellation of Leo the Lion in July of 2027. Then what's interesting, if we go back to today, as I mentioned, Jupiter and Saturn seem to be in a standoff. So ever since the Revelation 12 sign and all this began, Jupiter has been on this side of the ecliptic, and Saturn has been over here. But, and again, Jupiter representing the body of Christ and Saturn Satan, Jupiter is about to pass Saturn. So it's going into retrograde. But by the end of this year, it'll pass Saturn. And for the whole rest of Jupiter's transit around the ecliptic and the story of redemption, it'll be beyond Saturn's reach, so out of the grip of Satan. which I believe is a sign that, so it looks like it'll actually be in December sometime. It's a sign that the church is now free and safe from Satan's reach. One possible interpretation. And of course, in Revelation 13, Satan gives his power to the beast. So Satan descending, and eventually it'll get pretty close to Sagittarius, and I see that as the passing of the baton. And that's the fourth constellation. And so then, over the course of the tribulation, Jupiter would go through Capricorn for about a year, Aquarius for about a year, Pisces for about a year, Aries, and then Taurus, and then Gemini and Cancer. So 7 constellations to represent the 7 years of the tribulation. Cancer is like passing the threshold, and then near the end of the tribulation, Jupiter will just enter Leo, conjuncting with the King's star. And then shortly after, Venus will also come in, the bright and morning star, returning to Israel. And also, just because I'm really concerned with being accurate in what I teach, I wanted to correct a mistake that I made. I mentioned the eyes of Taurus and how they're a really perfect reflection of Christ's eyes as a flame of fire, because they're both orange giants. And I mentioned that they were, as I know, the only stars directly representing the eyes of a character or constellation. But I was mistaken, because the head of Medusa up here, interestingly with a bunch of serpent heads, also looks like eyes of a character with Algol and Gorgonia tortilla. So there may be a few others, but that's not super common to have eyes represented. But it could also be, as I mentioned, there's so many aspects of Taurus and Auriga that seem to represent Revelation 19, with the shepherd holding a rod, and Christ returns with a rod of iron. But there's another horn coming up, which could represent the sword proceeding from Christ's mouth, because in Revelation 19, both weapons are mentioned in the same verse that Christ is carrying. And his eyes are as a flame of fire. And there are those following him on white horses, the Pleiades, as if the church is gathered together, following along behind him. And Auriga looks like a door, gateway, or portal out of heaven. And so it's as if heaven's standing open. And then Taurus, of course, means to, in the Hebrew word, means to return or to come. And this is the 9th constellation nearing the end. So I think this is a really beautiful picture of Revelation 19. But there are aspects of this, as I talked about, that seem to point to the rapture as well, 7 years earlier. But I also speculated that this could have originally been a horse. And it could be that Perseus, which is a mythological pagan figure, may have originally been the rider on the white horse. And so it could be that this is the horse, and instead of 2 horns, it could be the rod of iron and the sword proceeding from his mouth. And this is the door standing open in heaven. And Perseus could actually be the rider on the white horse. And it could be that the head of Medusa is actually the head of the dragon that he's crushed. Notice all the serpent heads coming out. So that's just a little bit of speculation. And so that's all. I just wanted to kind of fill in a little bit on that and go over some other points to add on to it. And then just in terms of date speculation, I wanted to propose that we may kind of see a scenario unfolding right before our eyes. I started really following prophecy really closely in 2010, and I've seen some big, what look like contractions or kind of waves, prophetic waves that grow bigger and closer together as the years have gone by. And we've seen many high watches come and go, and things sort of seem to level out afterwards. And I would just suggest that that's the power of the restrainer in us that's working to restrain lawlessness and restrain the man of lawlessness from revealing himself. Because God is patient that none should perish, but all come to saving knowledge of the truth. All come to eternal life. All come to the knowledge of Christ. So he's exceedingly patient. And but, however, that said, really starting with New Year's Day of 2020, we've seen so many things come, and they just keep building. And so we've seen high watch days come and go, but things continue to build. There seems to be no let up. It doesn't seem like things are going back to normal. It seems like a second wave of coronavirus is actually about to hit pretty soon, and is hitting in some areas. And then to top it off, we have nationwide riots, and those are actually spreading overseas. And tens of millions around the world have lost jobs, and so the situation is really spiraling. So I would propose that next month we may very well see Israel annex about 30% of Judea and Samaria, what the world calls the West Bank. And and then adopt the deal of the century, at least in pieces, at least the key elements of it. But the mapping committee is actually currently developing Israel's final borders, and they're going to regard them as such. And so if they pass that into law, then Israel, after being pushed by the United States, is actually going to divide its own land. And if it annexes about 30% of the West Bank territory, I would propose that we may see lawlessness and riots really increase tenfold this summer until we have a real international issue very close to how it's described in Matthew 24, with kingdom against kingdom and so forth. We may see war, we may see some pretty crazy stuff. And I don't think that means tribulation has begun, because we have to be raptured and removed before that, but sort of a taste of things to come. So if Israel does in fact push annexation through next month, then I would propose that the Antichrist comes on the scene this fall, and the world being unable to get Israel to back down from that, the Antichrist comes in and he agrees to the deal of the century, but the compromise is that the settlement building freeze, which is going to be 4 years in the deal of the century, gets extended to 7. And he says, we'll agree to the deal, but Israel, you have to freeze settlement building for an additional 3 years to make 7 years. And that in and of itself could be the Daniel 9:27 covenant that is strengthened, that is made to prevail. So that's just some speculation. And then whenever that would be, Feast of Trumpets or Yom Kippur or something, the rapture would precede that. So that's it. Hope that's been enlightening to you, and blessings to you all, and Maranatha.